Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Welcome. As you can see, I'm in my vehicle right now. I'm on like a road trip of some sort. Well, it's spring and it's getting to be a little bit warm. Although we had a bit of a summer for I think 1 or 2 days where the temperature just all of a sudden went up, and then all of a sudden it's back to spring. So I don't know, maybe it's a glitch in the matrix where the weather just keeps changing. Anyway, welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show, where I focus more on the high availability and disaster recovery of not just database platforms, but in general. Like, how do you implement high availability and disaster recovery solutions? And it's not just for the point or for the purpose of implementing a solution, but really trying to achieve a goal. High availability has become critical in today's business demands, where an application, a platform, a service needs to be available 24/7. And it's not just enough for you to know what technologies to use, how to implement the solution, but also looking at the bigger picture. And I can understand, people like us who are geeks, DBAs, sysadmins, people who are in the front lines. We want to know what the strategy is. We want to know how to implement such solutions. But we also need to take a step back and see the bigger picture and how all of these things, when put together, actually meet the overall objective. Right? So it's more than just the technology. It's more than just the solution. It's everything that you need to consider. I like to put it and look at it from a high level, like looking at the bigger picture, and then based on like different teams, their capabilities, their resources available. This is where I start coming up with a solution that would meet the overall goal. Today's topic, and this is something that I have been thinking about for a couple of months now. Plus the fact that I used to be a developer. Today's topic is all about how developers and why developers need to be included in HADR conversations or discussions. I used to be a developer. Started out as a desktop-based or apps-based developer. This was back in the Windows. Was that Windows 95 or Windows 98 days? Visual Basic 5, progressed and started doing web-based applications using ASP.NET. And then I realized I'm losing a lot of hair. I cannot afford to do that. So I switched and pivoted to focusing more on data, like databases, data platforms, mainly because I've seen the trend. We are collecting more and more data. We are storing that data. Somebody needs to take care of it. Somebody needs to make sense of that data. And so I pivoted, moved from being a developer to more of the infrastructure side and database side, and now on the data platform, overall data platform, and constantly looking at ways on how to make sense of the data. Although I specialize in high availability and disaster recovery, I still look for opportunities to make sense of the data that customers and clients are collecting. Because what's the point of collecting all of this data when we're not going to make sense of it, right? This topic, like I said, kind of goes against the grain of, or the way of thinking that, hey, only sysadmins, platform engineers, these are the only people responsible for taking care of HA and DR. They're the ones proposing design. They're the ones coming up with the solution, and they're the ones needing to take care of it once it's out in production, right? Operations and maintenance. But let's bring the developers in. And again, this is me taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and asking the question, are we really meeting the objective based on the solutions that we come up with, right? Thinking into or taking into account, again, in SQL Server terms, always on availability groups, failover clustering, or any type of high availability solution, you need to bring in the developers, because at the end of the day, their applications need to connect to the databases, right? Their applications are the ones that will store data in databases, manipulate the data in the databases and make sense of that data. So we need to bring them into the conversation because they're part of this. And this is something that I also ask a lot of my clients. Look, there is no point in building a highly available database platform whether you decide you want to do always on availability groups, failover clustering, or whatever types of technology, if the database is available, yet the application could not connect to it because, well, application's down, or the application's not highly available, there's no point, right? I almost always use the example of working with Amazon. I'm pretty sure you have bought something off of Amazon.com, right? Maybe the phone that you're using right now or the laptop that you're using right now, you bought it off of Amazon. When Amazon's main e-commerce site goes down, you don't say, hey, it's a network problem, or it's a database problem, or it's the web front end. You don't think like that. We assume it is Amazon in general. The site's down. We don't say, oh, it's a packet loss in the network that caused. No, we don't, right? As end users, we think of it as the entire thing is down. That's why you start calling customer support, or wait until the entire thing's back online. And this is how you need to think about high availability. You need to bring in everything and everyone involved in order for you to build high availability solutions. And again, this is also one of the reasons why you need to bring in the developers. You need to bring them into the conversation. And I came up with like 4 things, 4, not 3, but 4 things on why you need to bring in the developers into the conversation anytime you're looking at high availability and disaster recovery, right? Get your pen and paper. I got my pen and paper ready. Start taking down notes. Here's the first one. Your developers need to design their apps to be HADR aware, right? You have to tell your developers. The developers need to be aware. Anytime they're building an app, it has to be HADR aware. I've seen cases, again, where DBAs and sysadmins will build an infrastructure. It's highly available, like databases. SQL Server, you got AGs, you got failover clustering. It can automatically fail over in seconds, literally in seconds. And I appreciate the fact that you've put in the time, the effort, you've done your research, you did a POC, everything works fine. But what about your apps? Are they HADR aware, right? If something goes wrong with the app, how are they going to bring the app back? Is there a mechanism in place for it to be highly available, right? Again, there's no point in putting your databases, making them highly available, making your network stack highly available if your apps are not highly available. There's no point. Like I said, end users, people like us, consumers, we don't really care. If the site's down, it's down. Okay, so you have to make sure that your developers are designing the app, not just the app in general, but the entire stack that the app runs on top of, like entire platform. Are you building a PHP app? Are you building a React app? And is that even highly available? What happens when the app crashes? Is there going to be a process that would spin up a new instance of the app? If it's a web app and it's running on a web server, if the web server goes down, is there going to be another web server that's going to be spinning up, right? These are things that you need to ask your developers. Did you design the application to be HADR aware, or even highly available aware? Okay. It's not enough to have the infrastructure and the database to be highly available. The app also needs to be highly available. I remember a client of mine that I worked with. They're a big global tech company. They're based in Canada, and they wanted to implement a database availability solution. And I asked them, so what's your goal? The goal is both high availability and replication. Meaning, so the way the application works is that they want to segregate the traffic coming from geographical locations. Meaning, you got 2 data centers, for instance. Any traffic or any client request coming in from the West Coast will be redirected to their West Coast data center, and any of their East Coast requests and beyond will be coming into their East Coast data center. And so I asked them, so is your application built to handle this? Crickets, right? Because for one, we can build the database platform, the infrastructure, the networking, top to bottom. If the application is not able, it's not capable of handling traffic that would allow them to be both resilient, highly available, and in this case also scalable, to the point where you're partitioning the traffic coming from different locations, then you just built something that cannot be used in case something happens, right? Bring your development team, your software architect, in the HADR conversation. Ask them, right? There is no point in building a highly available database system if the apps that are going to use these systems are not highly available, right? That's the first one. Make sure that the apps and the developers and the designers and the architects, software architects, are aware that their apps need to be highly available, right? That's the first one. The second one is that growth and scale is inevitable. In fact, I have this, if you're familiar with Moore's law, where the speed of the processing capabilities of modern computing devices will increase exponentially over time, I kind of have my own Moore's law to that effect when it comes to data, right? The growth of a business is directly proportional to the growth of your data. And I'm not just talking about garbage data. We're just collecting data from just about anywhere. I'm talking about transactional data, data that the business uses to generate revenue. For instance, if you're an e-commerce platform, the amount of transaction that you're generating from your e-commerce platform tells me something about the growth of the company, and the data directly correlates to the amount of growth that the company is getting into, right? You have to think about that. Your 25 gigabyte size database today would become 250 gigabytes in a couple of years, maybe. Or sometimes if there's an exponential growth, it could grow to 200 gigs or even terabytes in a matter of months, right? Acquisitions come in, and you need to design for growth and scale. So it's not just enough for you to think, oh, standalone instance is more than enough. I can put my database in a standalone instance, and that's good, right? I'm looking at some of the projects that I've worked with in the past, where initially they designed the app and their business model to only cater to East Coast clients. Next thing they knew, a couple of years later, they now have to deal with West Coast clients. So now they have to re-architect the application. And we're talking about point number one, where you have to design the application to be highly available, to be in the same way with the database, build a database platform that would cater to both Pacific or West Coast clients and East Coast clients, right? Because now you're following the sun, even though you're working with customers who only work between 9 to 5, but that's 9 to 5 Eastern plus 9 to 5 West Coast. And not just that. What if you decide, hey, we want to expand to Europe, for instance? So you're now building a system that could maybe only needed during business hours, normal business hours, but 9 to 5 European time, like GMT +2, plus 9 to 5 West Coast, which is GMT -7, I think, or -8. You have to cater for that. So now your availability extends throughout those different time zones, right? The workload might be the same, but now you are extending your operations time between Eastern and West Coast. So you have to accommodate for that, right? So the data increases over time as a side effect of growth, acquisition, companies growing. Take into account, again, not just getting your developers involved with designing an HA-aware app, but also taking into account data that will grow alongside with it. I just use that example of time zone differences when you're working with a platform that now needs to be available from Europe time zone to North American Western or Pacific time zone, right? In addition to that, if the database now is just 25 gig, it's a different conversation when you're looking at a database that has grown to 250 gig, Why? Because now it takes longer to recover a database that's 250 gig compared to how long it will take to recover a database that's 25 gig. That would factor into your recovery point and recovery time objectives, right? So if you did not think about growth in the future, because some people would say, hey, when we started, backups only take 5 minutes. Now it's taking 12 minutes. Now it's taking 20 minutes. Well, how long does it take for you to restore? Because if you want to achieve high availability, you need to make sure that you take into account growth, exponential growth of the business alongside with exponential growth of the data, right? Still meeting those recovery objectives and service level agreements. Okay. The third one, and this is something that I've written about, I've written a blog post about it in the past. Developers need to be aware of the fact that their choice of data types will have a significant impact, not just on the size, but on recoverability, right? I'm looking at data types that might seem, well, insignificant. For instance, using an integer or appropriate data type, that is, using a date time data type versus using string data type or character type data type to represent dates and times. For instance, if I'm building an app that takes into account date of transactions, and I'm not really concerned about microseconds, I can, design the data type according to the precision of what type of data I want to consider, right? There might be a difference between, of course, there is a difference between data types for date time versus string. Now, some people think, oh, it's 16 bytes or 14 bytes or maybe 100 bytes. But 100 bytes will exponentially grow over time, right? For instance, I'll just use an example. 100 bytes for an additional data type or an existing data type, multiply that by, for one row, multiply that by millions of rows, or 1 million rows. 100 byte times 1 million, 1 meg. But what about multiplying that across multiple tables? Not to mention, you create an index based on that column that has that specific data type. Well, you're also increasing the size of your index, right? What about, wait, I'm now building an availability group or even backups. The size of the data based on the data type compounds and contributes to the size of your backup. Not only that, if you're using technologies like log shipping, then the size of the data type impacts the amount of transaction log records generated, which affects the size of your backups, which affects your log shipping or database mirroring or availability groups, anything that has something to do with copying transaction log records, shipping it over to standby and recovering it. It will affect your recovery point and your recovery time objective. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, it's just a couple of bytes. We have terabytes and terabytes of storage available. It's not about the capacity of your storage. It is about meeting your recovery point, the amount of data that you can afford to lose, and the recovery time objective, the amount of time that you have in order to bring the database online. I mean, you can just try this out for yourself. Not in production, by the way. Create a database that generates massive amounts of transaction based on certain data types, and then just restart SQL Server and measure the time it takes to recover that database, versus making some modifications to some of the data types, using the smallest data type possible, generate the same amount of transaction, restart SQL Server, and measure the time it takes to recover the database. You would see a huge difference when it comes to not just size, but the impact of recovering the database, restoring the database, copying that transaction log records across standby servers. I mean, it's just physics. The fewer data, or let's not use data, because I know we're talking about data types. Fewer stuff is easy to carry and move around versus large stuff. If I have a box, 2x2 box, and I put a lot of stuff in there, it's a lot heavy. There's going to be more time and effort that would take for me to move that from one area to another versus, a few pieces of something in that box, right? The same thing with data types. The data types impact the way transaction log records are generated. It affects the way those log records will be copied over to your standby, whether it's log shipping, availability groups, or database mirroring. It impacts the way your backups behave because now you have more data to store on your backups, and it impacts the way your restores are done. It will take longer because now you have to restore more data, right? Again, developers don't think about it because they think, oh, it's date. But wait, do I just need date, or am I using UTC date? Or use the minimum data type, the smallest data type possible that would account for potential growth in the future. Not like, yeah, I'm going to use a GUID value, right? Unique identifiers, and I've seen this a lot with ORMs. But again, I was guilty of this back then. I've seen this so much with ORMs, primary key, or primary key. I want this column to be my unique identifier, and they use a 64-byte GUID value. I can spend an entire hour or so talking about how GUIDs, unless of course they're sequential IDs, could not be good candidates as a clustering key, right? A clustered index. So again, developers need to be aware that even the choice of data types they're using could impact high availability and disaster recovery. I wrote a blog post about that when it comes to using specific data types and how much transaction log records are generated based on one data type versus another, while keeping consistency when it comes to the data being stored on those columns using those data types, right? So I've talked about, one, the need for your developers to be aware that they have to design their applications to be HADR aware as well. I talked about the fact that growth and scale is inevitable. It's just nature of the business, unless of course the business is mismanaged. There's no opportunity for growth, and then the business dies or gets acquired by another one. Growth and scale is inevitable. It is going to happen. You got to prepare for that, right? Number 3 is that data types and the choice of using the right data types affect high availability and disaster recovery in more ways than you can ever imagine, right? And number four, bugs can cause outages, right? Software will always have bugs, always, right? They're built by humans who make mistakes. Anytime you're rolling out software, it could potentially have bugs. We don't know. I might be looking at a SQL Server bug. I was working on a version of SQL Server 2019 a couple of minutes earlier. I may be looking at the bug, and that bug could potentially cause an outage. And we're looking at an app here. Okay, you can do a quick Google search on how, I think it was Delta Airlines, and of course I'm a frequent flyer. Delta Airlines encountered an outage a couple months or years ago, based on an app update. They tried to fix a bug on an app in production. Probably didn't went through rigorous testing. It was an emergency change. And again, things like these happen, right? There was a bug in the app rolled out in production. People started using the app. Next thing you know, it led to even more catastrophic issues, like the server was down, the app was down, they couldn't do the transactions. An app bug, again, is inevitable. Software technology is made by humans who make mistakes, and those mistakes have catastrophic impacts, which is why the developers need to be aware. And again, this whole thing about DevOps and CI/CD has become a thing. I can talk about that. I've written an entire book on how you can containerize your SQL Server databases for CI/CD purposes. But the point is this: we're still going to make mistakes. We're humans. Apps, software, whatever thing that developers, I say thing, like it's code, whatever it is that they're working on, whether it's a bug fix, can also introduce bugs in the future, right? So you have to think about, hey, how can we mitigate this so that we catch the bugs even before it hits production, But unless you are aware that a bug could potentially cause catastrophic issues, again, most developers will think about it, hey, it's a bug, we'll fix it, right? They don't have, well, most of them, they don't have that exposure to when an outage happens and they need to be woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. When they start to think about that, and when they're in the spot trying to fix that issue, then they start to think about how can we reduce the amount of bugs that gets pushed out in production so that we don't get woken up at 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning because the server or the app goes down and now it's code red. We need to get everybody on board. Again, there is no escaping the fact that bugs will happen because software is written by people who make mistakes. Well, it's inevitable, right? Just like growth in scale is inevitable, bugs are also inevitable. But thinking about how your code release could potentially affect a production instance or production server may not be the database, right? May not be the database. But again, we're looking at the entire stack, not just the database, but also the app. Because how can the app connect to the database? That's highly available. If the app is not working because there's a bug and they have to contain that bug in order for it not to cause more problems. Again, these are the things that your developers, and again, you may be a developer listening to this and you're thinking, wait a second, I don't really need to think about that. Sure you do. Your app is going out in production, right? You've worked so hard to create an app. You've worked so hard to get that bug fix or that patch out there. You put in the time and the effort and the research to make sure that everything is working, only to realize that, hey, it caused more problems. You don't want it to be an RG or a resume generating event, right? Again, it's inevitable, but we want to make sure that we mitigate that. And it starts by, having your developers, or again, if you're a developer, being a part of those conversations, even if you're thinking, hey, wait a second, this is just what I'm really, this is the only thing that I'm responsible for, this one module, this one functionality, and I'll do everything that I can to make sure that it works. Well, it is going to be part of a bigger thing. And how good will your code be if the other pieces of the code isn't working? So you have to bring it up to the table, put it on the table, and talk about how you can make, number one, your apps to be highly available, right? Are they HA aware? Doesn't matter if you put it on high availability infrastructure like a load balancer, for instance. If it's a web app, you put it on a load balancer. Well, even if it is a load balancer, but you did not design the entire app to be HA aware, well, maybe the apps will only go to one web server instead of being load balanced, right? Because you didn't roll it out on the other load balancer or servers in the load balancer or in the load balance farm. Again, become aware of the fact that you need to design your apps to be HADR aware. Growth, number two, growth and scale is inevitable. It's just the nature of how healthy organisms function, whether it's a business, and in this case, data directly correlates to the growth of the business, right? Number three, the choice of data types directly impact HA and DR when it comes to recovery point and recovery time objectives, right? The larger the data type that needs to store the specific data, the longer it would take for you to recover your databases from backup, the longer it takes for you to copy the generated data over to a standby, like a log shipping secondary, database mirroring partner, or an available group secondary replica, right? And number four, bugs can cause outages. It's inevitable. We're humans. There's nothing to be ashamed of being human. Bugs will happen. And you have to have a rigorous process to prevent bugs from cascading on being rolled out into production that could eventually cause massive outages, right? Developers, I'm showing you some love here. I'm just saying, I used to be a developer. I don't hate developers, by the way. I don't want to hate my old self. But what's interesting? It's the developers who ended up becoming infrastructure people, who end up working on databases, are one of the most, they're the ones who are very efficient and productive, because now they're looking at ways on how to make life easy by either writing an app to make life easy for them, scripting things, automating things. So you do have an advantage as a developer, right? But then you have to put yourself in a way of thinking or in the mindset of, hey, I will be supporting this down the road, the app, of course. How can it be highly available? And if it's not highly available, how can we make it highly available and design it in such a way that you can make it highly available, right? That's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA DR show. Again, developers, I'm showing you some love. Love you guys. Tune in again for the next episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. And again, if you need help with anything high availability and disaster recovery, I've been working with a few customers where initially it was their developers, or rather their sysadmins and DBAs who need to be taking care of HA and DR, until we started looking at the design of the database, the design of the app, and how the app can be improved in order for it to be highly available. Reach out, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation. Who knows? This could probably be your step towards a promotion, because now you're putting things on the table and suggesting, hey, we need to make this app highly available. It's contributing a lot to the bottom line. It's helping the company grow. It's about time for us to grow as a business using the apps that you wrote, right? Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation. All right. Join in again for another episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I've switched, and again, this is me just being a data professional and looking at patterns. I switched the schedule from Friday. I used to do this on Friday morning. I switched it to Sunday. I think because of the pandemic, most of the people have been either ordered back to work, maybe back to the office, so now they couldn't do this on Saturday or Friday rather. So now they're switching and watching. I did it once or twice where I had the episode on a Sunday, and all of a sudden, I've seen people either commenting and watching. So I'm shifting things a bit, and this is also one of those things where you got to know how to read the data and the facts and make decisions based on the data, as what I do as a data professional. Again, enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again on the next episode. Goodbye.